Hello, AP Comparative. This is Andrew Canine, live from Studio Room 2C, where there's always room to see how countries compare. Happy Friday. It is Friday, April the 3rd. Lots of announcements to get to in the world of AP, specifically to AP Comparative Government. Today we are looking at topics 1.5 and 1.6. We are talking about perfect topics as we study current events and as we study comparative political science, those concepts of power and authority and how power and authority can change in our different countries. Speaking of power and authority, let's talk about some of these changes. College Board, we have a date, and the date for the exam is, let me get to this. There we go. The date of the exam is going to be May 22nd, 2020. That's going to be at noon Eastern time. We'll talk a lot about the technology and the process of using the technology to do these new AP exams. There'll be a lot of resources out there made available, and I'll speak to that as well. But we're just going to get to the basics today of some of these changes that have come our way. And the first change is the change of the date of the exam to May 22nd, and that's at 12 p.m. Eastern time. And again, we're looking at approximately a 45-minute exam, and there are updates published. You can go to this website for students, apcoronavirusupdates.collegeboard.org/students. And that's a place where you can see some of the other changes. We also have two FRQs that have been announced that are going to replicate FRQ number 2 on the original exam, and that's the quantitative analysis. I went over a quantitative analysis yesterday. The quantitative analysis is any question that deals with a data set, a table, a line graph, a chart. So we've done some examples of those already. We'll do a number of other examples of quantitative analysis. And the other type of question that we're going to get to actually today is the argument essay with some revisions. So I have this website up here, this link. If you'd like to go in there and look at some of those revisions, you can go there and see what two FRQs. Again, it's the quantitative analysis and the argument essay. There'll be some slight revisions to the argument essay that I'm going to speak to today. And I'm going to do several examples of argument essays as we move on through these lessons. So going back, if you are just joining us today, I'm using a lot of materials that come from the AP course description presented by College Board. This is apstudents.collegeboard.org. You can see that address. You can go straight to the PDF of this document. A lot of the coding I'm talking about is thematic. Many of the teachers teach comparative government country by country, and that's a perfectly fine way to teach the class. But the way that the materials are presented by College Board that I'm referring to with the codes and the concepts that I'm referring to come from the course description. You can get it at that web address. You can also go to the Two Teachers webpage created by Mr. Dan Larson at citizenu.org. Make sure you go to Comparative Corner. There's plenty of AP US government prep materials, and you can see what Mr. Larson's been working on over his spring break. Again, we're looking at the exam date of May 22nd, 2020. We're going to actually do some really, I think, quality prep for that today, not just in content, but also in skills. So first of all, we love to start with our shout outs, our teacher shout outs. Keep those coming in at hashtag APCompGov2020. A number of shout outs from across the country to Mrs. Stewart at Warren Township and Mrs. Silberberger in Washington. Oh, I know Mr. Chiravino at Brother Rice up in Michigan. Welcome. Thanks for your students for tuning in. And Mr. Frihor at Green Hope, that is in Cary, North Carolina, which is coincidental because I am broadcasting to you live from Cary, Illinois. So welcome to his students down in Green Hope and Cary, North Carolina. And of course, let's not forget Mr. Vose. Thank you, Mr. Vose students, for tuning in You have a terrific teacher. We've also had some great uh, Twitter moments of country examples of democratization. That's a topic that we've been looking at this week, the difference between democracy and authoritarian government, and also this concept of democratization. And Chris G points out that democratization doesn't just happen in countries that are moving from more authoritarian governments into more what we call democratic consolidation. But he pointed out that the United Kingdom Supreme Court that was created almost 10 years ago is an example of, or could be seen as an example of democratization, in that it increased the independence of the judicial branch in the United Kingdom as an example of democratization. So please keep those examples coming. Tweet those to hashtag APCompGov 2020. Thanks also to our teachers who are providing examples. Speaking of Kerry, Mr. Kerry Waxler, everyone's talking about Kerry today. Mr. Kerry Waxler has put some great examples out there at hashtag APCompGov 2020. Right before I came on air, he was putting some really timely examples on. And Mr. Tesh has an example of United Russia. And even though there are elections in Russia, even though United Russia has won most recently just over 50% of the votes, somehow, some way, United Russia controls over 75% of the seats in Russia's national legislature, pointing out that even though you have an elections, doesn't mean that those elections are democratic. And that was a great example from Mr. Tesh that he provided at Twitter hashtag APCompGov 2020. And Mr. Oppel down in Oklahoma has some really good examples of very timely journalism about different countries that we've studied, and how some are using this moment, particularly Russia, to crack down on civil liberties and the right to free press, and other examples of how some democracies are maintaining quarantines, essentially using much more restrictions on people's movement, but how there are some contrasts between democracies and authoritarian governments. Super timely to be studying political science, especially comparative political scientists in these very historic days. So I asked you yesterday, what are some examples of power and authority that affect your daily life? Today we are talking about those two concepts, power and authority. They are essential concepts in political science, in both American political science and comparative political science. And the great thing when you study power and authority, maybe you took a sociology class in high school, or maybe you're thinking about taking sociology or majoring in sociology in college. These are concepts that really overlap between political science and sociology. In fact, one of the most famous sociologists out there, Max Weber, is cited by many, many political scientists in terms of how he observed people interacting with governmental institutions and within governmental institutions. He's written extensively about power and authority as a sociologist. So what are examples of power and authority that affect your daily life? I would invite you to tweet those to hashtag CompGov, APCompGov 2020. I was thinking of one last night I'll give you an example of, but essentially two basic definitions, and these are kind of definitions that I've kind of come up with perusing different glossaries and different examples on the internet. One is the definition of power is the ability of another to make you do something. Or it might be your ability to make others do your thing. So maybe you're going for takeout for lunch. And maybe your friends have enormous power and they're very influential and they've convinced you to go to Qdoba for takeout for lunch. Or maybe you have the power to make your friends go to Chipotle for lunch. So power is the ability to make someone do something, or for you to make others do your thing. Authority is the right to make you do something, or it's the right to make others do your thing. And there are different examples of authority, and we're going to be talking about those today. It can be formal authority. It could be the badge or the uniform of a law enforcement officer. It could be laws. It could be longstanding traditions. Or in the case of my family, I like to think I have the power to tell my middle son, hey, it's 2 a.m., Ted. It's time to turn off the Tiger King and get to bed. I'd like to think I have that power, but I know I have the authority to control the Netflix password. So in terms of the rights to control, yeah, I pay the Netflix bill. I control the password, and that gives me the authority to also enforce the power if Ted, my Tiger King, isn't interested in listening to me. So the difference between power and authority in everyday life, feel free to tweet out other examples to hashtag APCompGov 2020. Today we are looking, we're actually, double dipping Friday, 2 topics. We'll do this several times over the next 20 days together. Topic 1.5 and 1.6, with both deal with the topic of power and authority and the changes of power and authority. We really do want to look at how power and authority compare in our different countries. You're going to see plenty of similarities with constitutions, with the role of military and law enforcement, but you also see some notable differences, particularly between how democracies use power and authority and how authoritarian governments use power and authority. We are going to connect a lot of these discussion on power and authority to other topics, particularly in Unit 1, particularly as we get into topics 1.8, 1.9, 1.10, where we're looking at this concept of political legitimacy and stability. So we will be talking about power and authority in either directly or indirectly for several days. I am proceeding in order through Unit 1, then I'll make my way through Units 2 and 3. I'll be continuing to do a lot of practice questions. I like to put multiple choice questions in, but obviously I also like to emphasize FRQ questions, and I always try to write a sample of an FRQ. So hopefully if you're practicing FRQs on your own, you're modeling some of these mechanics and content in my writing style to show kind of how you can maximize points in FRQ writing. So key vocabulary word, we always start the lessons with key vocabulary. Of course, we are looking at power, we're looking at authority. I've just given you kind of some homemade definitions for those. We're also looking at what does it mean to be a source of power and authority. That's a really interesting concept that you can use to compare countries, a source of power and authority. We're also, it's our first time getting into terms when it comes to changes of power and authority. The word coup, or sometimes we use the full French phrase coup d'etat, and the word, I guess another French phrase, revolution, when we talk about the changes of power and authority. So when we talk about the sources of power and authority, think about what are those elements that would give a government or government officials the power to tell us what to do. And so for a more authoritarian government, of course, our stereotype is that it's going to be military force or law enforcement, because an authoritarian government is going to be more likely to use forceful coercion to get its peoples to comply with government policies. But we also have constitutions as a source of power and authority that certainly democratic and authoritarian regimes have. In some of our countries, we're going to look at the role of religion, particularly in Iran. Political parties can be a source of power and authority, legislatures, the laws that legislatures pass, and particularly in democracies, that popular support, particularly when there's faith, when there's legitimacy in those national elections or local elections, where people think that their vote matters, that can give government officials legitimacy to enforce their powers. These can change over time. We'll see some of those changes in our AP 6 course countries. I'm going to take you briefly through each of the 6 countries and kind of talk about, there's a little bit of history in here. I know some of our teachers of comparative government really like to delve into deep histories on each of the countries. I've been encouraged by my teaching partner over the years to do less history, but I do like to talk about the history of these countries when we talk about power and authority. So starting with China, we know the Communist Party has tremendous power in China. We'll see that the Constitution actually gives the Chinese Communist Party tremendous power. And much of that authority comes from the Chinese Communist Party's authority over the military. So this is a formal relationship between the People's Liberation Army in China and the Chinese Communist Party. So we know that the chairman or the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party is the president. He is the head of state of the government, but the most official title that the president also has is the chair of China's Central Military Commission, which essentially means that the leader of the party, the general secretary of the party, controls the PLA, which is tremendous power and authority in the country of China. When we're looking at Iran, certainly Iran has military and law enforcement, but one of the things that makes Iran very different from the other countries that we've studied is that Iran is a theocracy. And after the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, where the Shah of Iran, who was a monarch, a dictator of Iran, was overthrown, and what became this Islamic revolution in with the creation of the title of supreme leader, we know that Iran's constitution empowers the supreme leader, who has to be a religious leader from Shia Islam. That is the rule. That is part of the constitution. And that supreme leader has tremendous power as the head of state in Iran. And one of those powers that's part of the constitution is a Shia Islamic principle known as Waliyat-e-Faqih. And that's a Farsi, and essentially it means what's called the guardianship of the jurist, or the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. And essentially what that means is the supreme leader, and that the government officials that the supreme leader puts in power into the Guardian Council and into the Council of Experts, that those leaders have to fulfill the principles of Shia Islam. So essentially the government and the religious leaders are guiding policy to uphold Shia Islam. That's Waliyat-e-Faqih. You don't have to know Farsi on the test, but it is an example of power and authority in the Iranian Islamic Republic. In Nigeria and Mexico, one of the interesting parts of both of those countries used to be much more electorally authoritarian, not much electoral competition. And as I said yesterday, both of those countries, at least in their elections, have become more democratic, have had democratic consolidation of elections, where elections are much more competitive. So that's the example that the course description gives of a source of power and authority in Nigeria and Mexico, is this idea that elections have more legitimacy in both of those countries, that both of those countries we've seen this transition to multi-party republics, particularly following military rule in Nigeria and following single-party dominance by the PRI party in Mexico. So in fact, Nigeria's had a constitution since 1990. Nigeria's had this constitution since 1999, but it didn't have a peaceful transfer of power from one elected president to another until 2007. And it really didn't have an alternation of political parties controlling the presidency until the last 5 years, in 2015, with the election of the current president of Nigeria, Buhari. Mexico, again, had a dominant party, the PRI, for more than 70 years, ever since the creation of Mexico's constitution. But by 2000, Mexico went through this democratization. And so that becomes a source of power and authority, because elections in Mexico matter. We've actually seen the presidency and the legislature switch hands between 3 different parties over the last 20 years because of elections. So that becomes, that's the reason why elections in Mexico become a source of power and authority. With Russia, of course, Russia, one of the interesting parts about Russia in the course description is there's really only one name, only one person's name who was written in the College Board course description. And that, of course, is Vladimir Putin, who has been this charismatic authority, if you will, in Russia, this kind of dominant personality in Russian politics. And part of that dominant personality has been the cementing of power into the president of Russia, particularly when Putin has been president for most of the last 20 years. He came to the presidency in 1999. He has served 2 sets of 2 terms. He's currently in his 4th term. It looks like there will be changes to the Russian constitution that will continue Putin's rule as whatever title is created out of that. And certainly his party, United Russia, has become a dominant party during his presidencies. And so that becomes a source of power and authority, that tradition of centralizing power within Putin in a more authoritarian way, certainly less democratic. In the United Kingdom, I actually sometimes think United Kingdoms can be a complicated country for students to understand, partly because of its sources of power and authority. Remember, certainly you know that the most powerful government official in the United Kingdom is the head of government, who we call the Prime Minister, who is in charge of the majority party of the House of Commons. And yet the symbols and traditions of the United Kingdom, I think, get kind of complicated because the United Kingdom's head of state is a monarch. That monarch is not democratically elected. That monarch inherits his or her, in the case of Queen Elizabeth II, her position. And technically the monarch is also the head of the Church of England. So there's some religious capacity. But this is where, even though the United Kingdom doesn't have a constitution, we know that the hundreds of years of democratic tradition that have evolved over time, that even have recent examples of democratization, have made our sources of power and authority in the United Kingdom that empower the elected officials, like the Prime Minister, to actually have governing power. So even though the symbols of the United Kingdom seem to indicate that the Queen is in charge, she's really not. It's purely symbolic, that the real government power and authority rests with the elected House of Commons, and particularly the Prime Minister, who's in charge of that House of Commons. Some interesting examples of how the United Kingdom is so confident in their sovereignty or their sources of power is that the central government of the United Kingdom over the last 30 years essentially has devolved powers from the central government to the regional governments. And this really particularly started in 1997 with the Tony Blair Prime Minister role, where the House of Commons by law gave some of its central power to regional parliaments in Scotland, Wales, and I know I'm going to get fact checked on this one. Northern Ireland, to some extent, has had some of those devolved powers. Northern Ireland gets a little bit complicated and is complicated now, but some devolved powers to those three different regional governments. But again, let's not mistake, and we're going to get into this on Monday as we look at a federal versus unitary government. The central government of the United Kingdom still has that power, but it has devolved some of those powers since 1997. How a regime chooses to use power is a big determinant as to whether this regime would be classified as a democratic or authoritarian government. Straight from the course description, democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty using less power than authoritarian regimes. Remember that. This is where I really suggest that you read the course description, and it could be a really good review for test prep, because there's some very rich content in here that the more you read and the more you understand these notes, these essential knowledge points, the more I think you're going to be prepared to do really well on the AP comparative exam. So when we talk about the difference between authoritarian and democratic regimes, when it comes to sources of power and authority, this is the key point. You're going to see that come up in an FRQ here in a moment. The democratic regimes can maintain sovereignty using less power than authoritarian regimes. You should also note that power and authority can change over time, and sometimes that change can be gradual, as we've seen in the United Kingdom in a more democratic way. And sometimes that change in power and authority can be rather quick when it comes to a coup or a revolution. I'll give you a more formal definition of those two words and how they're different in a moment. But certainly we've seen examples of coups in Nigeria since its independence, before its 1999 constitution. Coups, and particularly military coups in Nigeria, were relatively frequent. And then we've noticed a number of our countries that we've studied went through revolutions in which a large portion of the population supported change to the entire political system. So that gets into some of the differences between coup and revolution I'm going to mention here in a moment. And we should note that sometimes these changes can be peaceful, and sometimes those changes can be rather violent. And particularly in some of the more violent coups or revolutions that we've seen in both Iran and Nigeria. So real quick, some examples of how those two concepts of how power and authority can change are different. So a coup or a coup d'etat is kind of a forcible takeover, oftentimes is violent, or with use of force or threat of force, even if it's not violent, that's still violent, a threat of force. It's a forcible takeover of a governing power, and it's typically led by elites. So very often it might be a military coup where a military group, generals or high-ranking officials will take over from civilian leaders. It could be a group of military leaders taking over from a different group of military leaders. It tends to be quick, and there tends not to be that grassroots support that you would see in a revolution. And it doesn't necessarily lead to it doesn't necessarily lead to a regime change. Just because you have a coup doesn't mean there becomes this long-lasting constitutional change to the political system. And we saw that several times in Nigeria prior to its most recent constitution. A revolution, on the other hand, that we've seen in Mexico in the early 20th century, and Russia and China with their communist revolutions, and then Iran with its Islamic revolution in 1979. Revolutions, on the other hand, are certainly led by elites, but there's also a lot of popular support where the masses, wide parts of the population take part in a revolution, and that revolution leads to a long-term change in the form of a government or a regime. So essentially, a revolution typically results in a regime change. And again, that revolution includes the masses, but it is always led by some group of elites. If you have country-specific examples of power and authority, please tweet those out to #CompGov2020. We're going to get into some practice questions here about power and authority. Here's a comparison question where it asks, which is the accurate pairing of how each regime type uses power. And so we have several descriptions under authoritarian regimes and several under democratic regimes. I'm going to give you a chance and read through those pairings to see which is the accurate pairing of how each regime type uses power. And the answer is letter D, that authoritarian governments use more governmental power to maintain sovereignty, while democratic regimes use less governmental power to maintain sovereignty. That's how that question could be asked in a multiple choice. We know this revised exam is not going to have multiple choice questions, but that can still be content knowledge that you can help you out. And hopefully you'll see that in just a moment. Second question here for topics 1.5 and 1.6. It's a country comparison, a multiple choice question. And I have several of these. Which of the following is an accurate pairing of countries with a source of authority in those countries? All right. So what distinguishes the authority of the United Kingdom versus the authority in Iran? Well, if you ever saw a question like this, certainly for Iran, you got to highlight on the role of Islam or theocracy or the role of religion. And certainly, hopefully you see Shia Islam here and make that connection that the United Kingdom has had hundreds of years of common law, judicial precedents as a source of authority. So that's not necessarily a formal thing, but it can change over time and sometimes slowly with common law in the United Kingdom, whereas Iran has religion as a source of authority, particularly with Shia Islam. Here's another matching a comparison between countries with their source of authority. Let's try to do Nigeria with Russia. Hopefully that stands out right at the top as we look at those dates. Interesting that the date of 1999 with Nigeria's constitution is also very similar to the time that Putin, I didn't mention Putin's by name here, but use that phrase sometimes that's used to describe Putin, that charismatic authority of a president elected 4 times in national elections since 1999. So even though the name Putin doesn't appear, hopefully the tip off here is a president elected 4 times since 1999, and that describes a source of authority in Russia with Putin. And then finally, the final multiple choice, comparing Mexico with China. So what would be a source of authority in Mexico compared to a source of authority in China? And I'm sure it didn't take you long to figure out that the right answer here is D, talking about Mexico's 1917 constitution, where multiple parties were elected to the legislature. It doesn't mean that they had power or majority control, but multiple parties were represented in the legislature. And certainly China, with its communist revolution that was led by Mao Zedong and his supporters. So that is how we can compare sources of authority in the countries, but let's get into our first example of an argument essay. This is the first time I've used a sample of the argument essay. This is assessing student skills to create a thesis, to provide examples of evidence from course countries, and also to use reasoning to explain why the evidence supports the claim. In a typical exam year, students would be assessed to respond or to create an alternative perspective and respond to that alternative perspective. But we've been informed by College Board that response in the rebuttal will not be scored on this FRQ. And again, this is going to be one of 2 FRQs that you'll be able to write, and you'll have at least 20 minutes to write this argument essay. Let me show you an example. This example, you might have seen this example before. It's in some College Board materials. I've altered it slightly, but essentially here's the prompt: is to develop an argument as to whether democratic or authoritarian regimes are better at maintaining sovereignty in a country. Hoping you might be familiar with that content if you've watched these videos. We're distinguishing democratic or authoritarian regimes, and we're talking about the word of sovereignty. How do you maintain control in a country? In order to do this FRQ, the argument essay, you do have to incorporate critical vocabulary words. That's why I've been emphasizing words from the very first lesson. In this case, they give you 3 words. They'll always give you 3 words. In this case, the words are power, authority, and the third concept is separatist movement. In the response, you have to do several tasks. The first task is respond to the prompt with a defensible claim or thesis that establishes a line of reasoning using one or more of the provided course concepts. You also have to support your claim with at least 2 pieces of specific and relevant evidence from one or more of the course countries. The evidence should be relevant to one or more of the provided course concepts. Those course concepts, again, that are going to be provided, they'll provide 3 course concepts, and you have to use at least one of the 3, power, authority, or separatist movement in this particular case. And then your final task is to use reasoning to explain why your evidence supports your claim or thesis using one or more of the provided course concepts. Okay. So, and then not part of the FRQ, I mentioned this before, not part of this 2020 revised FRQ, that it will be part of other FRQs going forward, is what's called the response or the counter argument or the alternative perspective. That will not be scored in this year's exam. So I am going to I've written the response to this particular question. The first thing you need to do is write a thesis. There are some tips on thesis writing. This, first of all, let me emphasize, this is not your AP English class. If you took an AP English class, I'm going to be breaking some covenants from AP English, proudly breaking some of those covenants. This can be a much more straightforward thesis. You can also use personal pronouns. I don't like pronouns. I really, really encourage my students to avoid pronouns like it or this or things. Those can be point killers in an FRQ. But you're going to see I actually use some personal pronouns later. Don't be afraid about using words from the prompt in your thesis. Going back again, this prompt is develop an argument as to whether a democratic or authoritarian regime is better at maintaining sovereignty in a country. I really want you to focus on which of these is better at maintaining sovereignty in a country. You're going to see I reuse this phrase quite often in my answers for this, and you're allowed to do that. You're allowed to reuse the vocabulary of the prompt in your thesis. What's super important here is you have to go beyond just repeating the vocabulary of the prompt to turn it into an argument, and then to provide reasoning where essentially you're saying why. You're explaining why this argument is, why one of these is better. Really emphasizing too in the thesis, I want you to see that I picked one or the other. Do not pick both. If you pick both, it's going to crash your grade on this. And I've seen a lot of really smart students when I've scored these for my AP US government class and in my AP comparative government class, they try to argue both sides. They try to pick both to show how smart they are. And it's a point killer on this particular rubric. So don't pick both. Pick one or the other, make that argument and support it. So I'm going to show you how you did it. And it's going to seem repetitive, but I'm hitting the points. And I'm going to show you how I hit the points. So a thesis is a democratic regime is better at maintaining sovereignty in a country because a democratic regime doesn't have to use as much power to maintain its governmental sovereignty. I don't know if you remember that essential knowledge point I emphasized. That comes very similar phrasing to what's in the course description. We're told a democratic regime doesn't have to use as much power to maintain its governmental sovereignty. And I really have to emphasize this word because. I know I've been saying this in a lot of my FRQ responses. This is particularly important whenever you're asked to create a thesis. When you're asked to create a thesis, it's very similar to when you're asked to explain why, when you've been asked to explain how in AP comparative free response writing, or yesterday we saw an example of to draw a conclusion from. It's super helpful to get the point to make sure you have a word of causation to show your reasoning. So a democratic regime is better at maintaining sovereignty in a country. That's my argument. Very simple thesis. And I'm going to start building this thesis because I've used a word of reasoning here, because a democratic regime doesn't have to use as much power to maintain its governmental sovereignty. Keep on going on. Try to build another sentence or two into this. It doesn't have to be a 5-sentence paragraph, but make sure you're complete. And a lot of times complete work means putting 2 or 3 sentences together and really emphasizing your argument, and make sure you use those words of reasoning. So my second sentence, a democratic regime doesn't have to rely on coercion as much as an authoritarian regime to maintain sovereignty, because the people in a democratic regime understand they have a degree of control on holding government officials accountable. So I've talked about what a democracy here is, and also the idea that I've re-emphasized this point, that a democratic regime doesn't have to use as much power. I've substituted the word power with coercion, contrasting with an authoritarian regime, but really essential. I've reused that word because here to show my reasoning. You have to have reasoning, a because statement or a causal statement. Therefore, that is why, due to. I like to use the word because as a full thesis, as an argument. Now we got to go into support the argument using relevant evidence. Use reasoning to organize and analyze the evidence. So this is where you can really, in these 2 paragraphs, your 2 evidence paragraphs, you can really rack up the points. The thesis point is 1 point. Okay, be complete. Make sure you're speaking to the prompt. Make sure you, try to throw in a word from the concepts. In this case, I've used power. Getting good habits of showing reasoning, but really you can rack up the points after you write that solid thesis with really good country evidence that's supported, that's connected back to your thesis, and that uses reasoning. And each of these evidence paragraphs that I've written here, there are 3 points in each of these paragraphs. This is a 7-point FRQ, 1 point for the thesis. And I like to think, essentially 3 points for really speaking well, writing well to the evidence. So let me show you where those 3 points come in here. So for example, the United Kingdom, I have to use at least one country, the United Kingdom uses its governmental power. Here I've repeated one of those concepts up there that we saw before to create policies that maintain its sovereignty. I'm connecting it back to the prompt, maintaining sovereignty in all parts of the UK, because here's why I get into reasoning, because voters have given the majority party, the House of Commons, the authority to be able to make policies throughout the country. So here's where I've gotten a little bit gone overboard. I've used another word of those concepts. This helps a democratic regime like the United Kingdom maintain sovereignty. I'm taking those words from the prompt here. Better than an authoritarian government, because I really want to emphasize reasoning here. I'm using a reason. Why? Because the UK can rely more on the mandate of the people, right? Democracy, mandate of the people, as its authority to use power without as much forceful coercion as often as an authoritarian government might have to use. So I've also developed some contrast with an authoritarian government here. So again, I'm using a country-specific example. They have elections. Those elections give the people power, the mandate of the people. The voters have given the majority of the House of Commons power. So I've used an example from the United Kingdom. I've also connected to those key words, power and authority. I want the reader to know that I know what those words mean. So don't be shy about kind of showing off that you know what those words mean in your writing. And then especially important, make sure you put reasoning. Make sure you include a due to or a therefore, that is why, or in this case, I've used because. And then get another 3 points for your second evidence paragraph. Again, this doesn't have to be an 8-sentence paragraph. But if you write effectively, you can really rack up points in both of these evidence paragraphs. Now, this is a little bit, you got to be careful with this. You can use 2 countries as examples, but the prompt is also saying that you can use 1 country multiple times. So I'm going to show you in future argument essays, I'm going to show you examples where I use multiple countries. But I wanted to start off with this first example of an argument essay using 2 different examples from the United Kingdom, but you got to make sure it's a different example. In that first evidence, I'm talking about elections in the United Kingdom. In this case, I'm talking about devolution in the United Kingdom. So you got to really make sure that both of those, if you are going to use the same country, make sure you're definitely using 2 different examples from that course country. So another example of this is from the United Kingdom, where the UK has devolved powers to some of its regional governments. So here's my point for my example. Without needing to use force to keep those regions part of the country, helping to prevent separatist movement. Oh, you don't have to use all 3 words. The 3 words, remember, that we're supposed to use are power, authority, and separatist movement. You only have to use 1, but if you're confident to use all 3, go for it. If you know what those words mean, again, make sure you're showing that you know what those words mean. So that would prevent separatist movements, that would challenge the UK's sovereignty. This shows that a democratic regime like the United Kingdom is better at maintaining sovereignty. I'm going back to my argument, back to my thesis. I'm really emphasizing this, better at maintaining sovereignty than an authoritarian regime, because, I got my reasoning in there, because a democratic regime like the United Kingdom can rely on the rule of law to devolve powers to regional governments and doesn't need to rely solely on force to prevent separatist movements in those regions from breaking away to become independent countries. So I've kind of reemphasized how the United Kingdom's use of devolution is a democratic principle without democracy needing to use as much power, doesn't have to use as much force as an authoritarian government, which is a way to prevent separatist movements. A real key thing to maximize your points. Just don't give me a country example. Just don't connect that example to the concept, but make sure you give a reason, okay? And a reason has to include some kind of phrase, a causal phrase, because, due to, or therefore. I threw an example. This is not part of the revised 2020 exam, and I don't want to confuse you by going into this too much. But in future years, when the alternative perspective is part of the exam, I put an example here of an alternative perspective I connected it to China's use of authoritarian authority and powers in quarantining Wuhan. So this is where you can use current events as examples, or in this case, again, I'm going to emphasize not part of the revised 2020 exam, but I know I'm running out of time. So I want to make sure you know that today's topic was about power authority, the sources of power and authority, coups versus revolutions. We will be talking about power and authority much more as we wrap up 1.8, 1.9, 1.10 later next week. Please feel free to tweet country-specific examples of power and authority to hashtag APCompGov 2020. And I'm going to leave you to on Monday, the next time we see each other, we're going to be talking about federal and unitary governments. Many, many examples from around the world, especially our course countries, of how central governments versus regional or local governments have responded to COVID-19. Some really interesting examples of the city of Moscow and what they've done. So if you see examples out there, please feel free to tweet those to hashtag APCompGov 2020. Please have a wonderful weekend. Get some rest. You've worked hard this week. You deserve it. I will next appear on these broadcasts on Monday, April 6th, as we study topic 1.7, federal and unitary systems. Thank you very much. Be well.